Yeah, I represent the Federation of Irish Beekeepers. My name is Willie O'Byrne. I'm just talking about the sycamore here. And I know that the native woodlands, I don't know what their interest is in this tree because it is a great tree in terms of beekeeping. We find it on the hedgerows, etc. And I'm just wondering, is it being eliminated from the native hedgerow business? Thank you.
I better take that. No, it's not been eliminated. What we're doing is we are controlling natural regeneration within existing woodlands. There's lots of sycamore in the wider landscape. There's lots of it in the hedgerows as well. But the idea would be to control it so that it doesn't take over at the expense of native species. And then the veteran sycamore and beech, for that matter, are also being maintained or retained in those woodlands because they're also important for biodiversity in themselves. And you have the likes of ivy for honey that we see in our woodlands. So in case people think it's a scorched earth policy, it's not. It's just that we have to control the regen. It's really important because in some of those woodlands it really takes over at the expense of native species, which are light demanding, and then the likes of beech and sycamore, which can survive better in the shade, tend to take over, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Vicky. I have to say as well, being around woodlands in Ireland, I mean, there's no risk that we're going to have any decline in sycamore. I mean, it just grows everywhere very freely, doesn't it? It's quite weedy. Another question there. The next disease comes. Yeah.
Thanks. This is for Declan. You mentioned that Dutch elm disease was a factor in losing elms, 3,000 years ago? Sorry? 5,000 years ago. And has that, we sort of, at least I see it as something that happened recently. So has it always been present, or has it re-emerged?
Yes, I'm not an expert in this area, but basically what happens is that you had a catastrophic decline when it was at its peak, and then subsequently after that, when the trees reach sexual maturity, the beetles, and get to a certain girth, the beetles then that carry the disease then reinfest. And then you get all these, so you got these, they get knocked back all the time. So that they won't get completely wiped out, but you do see them coming back from the stumps in the hedgerows. So I'm afraid that's what happens. So you will see them, and you'll see them in parts of the country, interestingly enough, where roads and shipping routes didn't influence woodlands that were isolated from those areas. Like in Brackloon Wood, actually, there's elms there that weren't hit with Dutch elm. But in the main, most of the population has been hit, and they just keep coming back from the resultant stumps.
Question for Alwyn about Scots pine. It's being used in the native woodland scheme in Ireland, and the stock is not from your native woodlands anyway, your native pine. How close do you think they are genetically with the Scots pine? Because I would have thought they're probably all from the same mixed stock, if you like.
Yeah, thanks for your question. That's a really good question. So we hopefully will have more data on that quite soon. The theory is that the Scottish Scots pine is descendant from the Irish Scots pine. So genetically, it could well be very, very similar. I guess you can understand the argument of propagating Scots pine from the native population that we've discovered and using that in the stock in the native woodland scheme. But I guess a counter argument to that actually carries on from the Dutch elm disease question is the more diverse our genetic base is for the Scots pine, the more chance there is of resilience for climate change and resistance to disease. So I think genetic diversity should be prioritised. But definitely I do think there's justification for also augmenting our amounts of native Scots pine that we know is native. I think so. So I think both together.
Thank you. More questions there? Yeah.
Another question for Declan. Declan, I was just in Brackloon last week and just noticed a lot of recent, the oaks, their tops are being blown off. It seemed quite more recent, like in the last couple of years at least, with the larger storms. And just wondering if the soil if there's an impact with the soil composition changing with all the climate change, and like the ocean would have, with the salt coming in, any kind of sodium sulfur kind of build up in the soil, if that would affect wood composition and blowing off tops.
It's an interesting question or theory, but I can't say that could be a factor. But I do think that a key issue in Brackloon, and we see it tomorrow, is that when oak, which was favoured at the expense of other native species and coppiced and then abandoned, then we're now at the senescent stage of a lot of those woodlands in terms of the oak. So a lot of the tops have been blown off. There's not much understory or trees or recruitment to replace them. We have a choice to make, I think, in terms of, do we actively go in and take out small coops of these oak and underplant them and allow natural regeneration in other parts of the woods as well to stagger the age structure, and also not be so hell-bent on favouring oak as much as we did in the past. In other words, favour other native species that are suitable for that particular soil type or ecosystem. So I don't think, to be honest, personally, that is to do with climate change as such. It's just that the trees are coming to the end of their cycle. They don't look very big because they grow slower. And we did some ring counts on trees in Brackloon, and some of them were over 200 years old. And if you looked at them growing on a lowland fertile soil, you'd say they're not even 100 years old. So it's fascinating that again, is to do with the environment they're growing in. So I think really it's down to a woodland management issue, but there could be other factors, of course, involved.
I know that we have a question here at the front, we have a question there, and we have a question from Ella. So we'll start in an arc this way.
A question about the grey spotted woodpecker. What's driving the westward shift? Is it climate change, or is it actually what Declan's just said? The woods have become more mature, so are now suitable for the bird.
Well, they aren't very picky about where they nest, as you could see from telegraph poles. And, you know, you go into a garden in London and you'll have them nesting in back gardens. So they're not really an oak specialist. I think it's just down to the sheer population increase. And that's the only theory in the UK, and that's the only theory I've heard put forward scientifically, is about the decline in starlings and lack of competition for nest sites. But we don't really know, but they're certainly doing very well as a species. And there's, you know, they arrived in County Down and County Wicklow, and they happened to just choose two of the best counties for oak woodland. But you know, I think they'll move into any decent habitat.
Question there.
I'm not sure if this question pertains to anybody in the panel in particular, but I would be interested to hear your take on what you know of the potential conservation management plan or management plan in general for what was once wild Navan, which has now been amalgamated with Ballycroy National Park, just north of Brackloon Woods in Mayo. And if there is any potential to incorporate some of the management strategies that you would see in the native woodland scheme on site, where wild Navan once was, what is now Ballycroy National Park. Could you comment on that?
Does anyone here know? Is anyone able to elaborate?
I'll jog your memory that Daniel Kelly did refer to it as an ecological mess.
I do know the area, but I prefer someone else on the panel if they want to. I mean, I have no problem taking the question, but the interest of just spreading it about. Okay, I've actually seen some of the area in question as well, and there's I think it's a fantastic but very ambitious development. I think there are huge issues in terms of management that need to be highlighted even more, such as what Daniel referred to in terms of the lodgepole pine and the spread of it, and indeed stopping its spread into the other parts of the park, never mind managing the existing plantation woodlands that are there. There are issues such as water quality that have to be taken care of, and like that, we can't just close the gate in a lot of these areas because a lot of them will blow and you'll have sediment going into the rivers and streams in the area. And there's also rhododendron, which is a massive problem there. Yes, it can be, but I think, to be honest, it's much wider than a native woodland scheme. It's a project like a LIFE project, or even bigger again, where you have a sustained management input over a long period of time and a very strategic plan to deal with the whole area and to manage it back towards, where possible, blanket bog, and where not possible, towards mixed native woodland. That's and of course the heath and wet flushes and so on that go along with those habitats as well. But that's the kind of broad brush, if you want to call it that, image I have for the area. But it's a massive task which will take huge resources to do that.
And do you know whereabouts it is in its stage of
Oh,
management?
it belongs. It's Wheelton National Parks and Wildlife Service. I'm not sure actually where it is in relation to that. No.
Yeah, okay.
Ella, up here with the question.
Thank you so much. That was such an interesting selection of presentations, and I have so many questions. We'll be here all day. But I just wanted to ask Maria, on your amazing presentation that blew my mind, like just two quick questions. One is you said that that Ireland isn't on the the council at EU level, and I just wanted to see why that is. I can imagine the answer, and how important it is that Ireland gets onto that. And secondly, we heard this morning from Dr. Kelly about the idea of contested spaces. And obviously at the micro level, then, you know, there you go. And there's so many sort of threats, as you were saying. And I just wondered, a very simple question is, you know, if there was one key thing that could be done, what would it be? What is the main threat that you think that we could actually do something about? Thanks.
Oh my God, there's a lot there.
So I don't mean to be greedy about questions, so even just the first one about the council seems quite important.
Yeah, I suppose we have one protected species among the fungi, lichenized fungi in Ireland, and that's Fulgensia fulgens, which is a blowout dune lichen in County Wexford. We have so many species we could protect because they are threatened, vulnerable, near extinction, or we don't know enough to know what to do with them. So we did find Hericium, so for example, it's a big dog tooth, big fungus growing on a tree near Paris Court Avenue. And unfortunately, it was part of the over 20 trees culled on that avenue for health and safety reasons in the last couple of years. So even getting the message out to the contractors, people managing the sites is difficult. So I would think support for people doing the research, perhaps a forum for the sharing of information is a good thing. We can't go backwards. We're really at a base level. And when you talk to Anders Dahlberg internationally, he's not angry at me for showing up at international meetings, but he and others are watching the space. And it has been said at international meetings that Ireland is with Albania and Iceland on how it treats its fungi. So that's embarrassing. And the second question, I've forgotten already. Sorry, fever. Okay.
Just as a
conspirator
of the
Speak into the mic, Howard.
sorry, as a co-author of the presentation, things that we can do if we realise that there are lots of sessile, if you take this concept of sessile, insect-laid eggs, spore setae of liverworts, fern indusia that make spores, tree flowers that produce pollen, catkins that receive pollen, seed making. All these processes are sessile in Irish habitats on each part of one tree in every woodland site in Ireland. So I'm turning it down to how do we deal with this empty niche problem? And if we accept sessile microhabitats as a research thing to do, then all we need to do really is to collate evidence for all the species, or whatever species you have in your own patch, proving conservation. So in order to do that, there's really a couple of things we only need to do. You observe...
Howard, can I just ask you to keep it brief, because there's
okay.
at least 5 other hands for
okay, sorry, yeah.
And we have less than 5 minutes.
Okay, so in terms of record abstracts, every observation of every species is really important for acknowledging. So I think if we do that, we're well on the way to solving it. Thank you.
Thank you. There is a gentleman here. Did you? Your hand is here? Yeah.
Actually, I just wanted to bounce on a question. I mean, that really important thing about why Ballycroy National Park has taken on this huge new challenge. I was wondering, can anybody from the National Parks and Wildlife Service address this? I mean, Ballycroy, our national parks are so important. So I'd really like to pass that question on.
I think Kieran just walked in halfway through your question, so we won't ask him to answer. That might be a discussion that we can pick up later on as well, when there's more people representing NPWS or Cuilche in a panel. We are at 1 o'clock. We can run over till 1:05, so I'm going to take just 2 or 3 more questions there.
Hi, I'm Keith. I'm local here in Delgany, so really excited to see everybody here and the enthusiasm. I'm a amateur eco-volunteer, not a professional like the rest of you guys. But of all the really exciting things I saw this morning, maybe the most exciting for me is that connection between woodlands and water. Not sure if you know, but it's the case here locally. The Three Trout stream flows just right by here and goes down through Delgany and out through Greystones. And locally, we're trying to keep that connection and revive people's interest in the woodlands and the water both together. And nationally, there's lots happening on river trusts being formed all around the country. So just interested, are the panel keeping connected with that and using that momentum on the water side and the momentum on the wood side and maximising those? Because I think that's perhaps our one of our best opportunities to make Ireland green again.
That's a very good question. Thank you. Yeah.
I'll answer that. There was a number of local people involved with the oral hearing for the Forestry water treatment plant upgrade. And what's a positive thing coming out of it is we're just in the process of starting up an East Wicklow Rivers Trust. So we're just setting up the legal entity to do that. So the more people who want to get involved, the better. So keep in touch and yeah, it'll progress.
I've had some involvement with Rivers Trusts as well across the country, and it is a massive, very recently growing thing. There's definitely one in Inishowen, there's one in Limerick, there's a National Association of Rivers Trusts starting up, and there's a new Waters and Communities Office by the EPA where there's officers all over the country who are facilitating community involvement, such as with Rivers Trusts. And there's definitely a huge potential there for woodland and water conservation to be amalgamated, and community-led schemes there are really crucial way to come at that. So if anybody here is interested, find out if there's a local Rivers Trust, possibly embryonic, and get involved with that.
Yeah, I'd just like to say as well, sorry, that the Forest Service and ourselves met with EPA staff on the ground in relation to the second cycle Water Framework Directive, and that, you know, people on there, I think they're employing 35 people to go to walk the rivers, identify pinch points, areas of pollution and so on, and we have woodland measures under the scheme, the native woodland scheme that was talked about earlier, to address that. So there are things happening at that level as well, which are very encouraging, because we've seen a decrease in staff on the ground in most other agencies over the years, whereas you know, with the EPA there's an increase, and also National Parks and Wildlife have just employed more rangers as well. So there's glimmers of hope there, because it's all very well having policy documents, but we need to implement them on the ground.
And just add to that, definitely, if I can, also check employ 30 farm advisory officers in the context of the Water Framework Directive. And again, the Forest Service will be meeting them and training with them in order to bring the message of where native woodland could best go right to the farmer. So between the scientific officers and the Teagasc advisors, there's a whole lot of new people coming into the mix as well in terms of promoting native woodland. So yeah, I think there's a very strong link between water and native woodland coming through.
Can I add to that there's the Air Framework Directive as well, so don't forget the interplay between water and air, and the fact that it's a powerful newer tool in helping with general environmental conditions.
One more question before lunch. Yep, here.
Sorry, it's not a question, it's just a quick point.
Just wait for the mic there. It's coming right.
Hello, it's just a quick point on those water and community officers. They are I know in Sligo, Leitrim, there's one officer that covers the 2 counties, and they seem to have money at the moment. So if anybody's looking for funding, they fund little community projects and that kind of thing. So it's worth knowing that and worth getting in touch with them if you have any kind of a project that would fall under there. It's communities and water officers. Okay.
Sinead Pearson is the community officer for Dublin and Wicklow. If anyone wants to help getting in contact with them,
Thanks. I think I'm just going to wrap up there, and we'll get to lunch. But this has been a really fascinating look at ecology and very in-depth detail, micro species and habitats, as well as the exciting, glamorous new things like woodpecker. And I'm really delighted to see that policy element coming in the discussion here, because there has been a lot of progress in policy around woodland conservation and water conservation as well. I am not sure that there has been the same kind of progress. I would love to know, maybe by this afternoon, a figure. What was the cover of native woodlands in Ireland at this last conference, where many of us were there in 2004, and what is that native woodland cover now? Because there's always a massive lag time between policy coming into play and that seeing any kind of impacts or effects on the ground. And often things can, while the policy gets better, the actual situation in terms of conservation can just get worse and worse, as many of us know. So it's really good to see even things like the discussion about the Waters and Community Office, and there are lots of, I suppose, little glimmers of hope, but they're in a situation where we really do need to communicate more and have more participation in all of these conservation efforts. And I know that community and ground up approaches has been mentioned throughout many of the talks as well, like in Bracklin Wood. I'd love to hear more about that. But thanks a million to all of the speakers who've been brilliant, and all of the questions, and enjoy your lunch. And we'll be back this afternoon. There will be a big discussion later on this afternoon as well with a lot of the speakers. Thanks.